Yeah, this is our recap for the year. It's kind of crazy, actually. I streamed a lot at the start of this year. Like, I think I streamed like every day for a month. I would literally stream day after day after day. Yeah, this is the year Splinky died. We should mark this. I feel like I don't know why that made me laugh. Splinky died as I started following you, I think. So let's move over here. Hello. So, I said this, right? Not the Google part, but been thinking recently about how even this classification of a simplified, quotations, simplified game causes people to invest less effort into improving their gameplay due to the implications of simplified gameplay, essentially translating to a pure focus on layer 1 interactions and not much else. I have a few things to comment on relating to this because not everyone understood what I was saying here. This topic has actually been on my mind for a while. By the end of Rev 2, I was actually super on the simplified train. All across Exert, I came to the conclusion that like some things are so difficult or so unnecessarily complicated in more complex games, right? Quotations complex. But I've always realized players tend to understand interactions almost better in more advanced games, but they don't tend to learn them as quickly, whereas it's almost like the inverse. Simplified games, it tends to be like a lot of people can just get the feeling of how interactions are supposed to go and how they're supposed to feel and what they're supposed to be. But then what they do is they don't really recognize what they're doing. So we'll get into that in a second, but I want to talk about like how some people reply to this, and we'll clarify what I mean. It's funny how many games classified as simple compared to previous games end up having a lot of complexity if done well. This comment is actually super good because this is honestly like the root of the discussion. So like a lot of games have a lot of what would be described as simple sort of interactions, right? A common one, for example, is in Exert or older Guilty Gears, where you have like layer 1 frame trap, which like a good example is, let's say Soul does 2S6H. Most people consider it a frame trap, right? You could IB. If you IB, it changes the game significantly. A good example is, let's say if Johnny instant blocks Soul's 2S, 5K will beat Soul doing 2S6H, which means if you recognize this, you would do 2S5H, which would become a frame trap because of the less frame advantage on instant block. You could think of it like this is kind of an example of a advanced or a complicated sort of interaction. Not so linear. There's a lot of ways you can play around it depending on like backdash, movement, whatever. The baseline interaction, it's still the same. Like people don't view them one-to-one. Right? That's basically it. This is actually the thing that gave me this idea for the discussion. And no slack to this person whatsoever, but they say it doesn't make too much sense to invest high amounts of efforts in something that will net you less than 0.01 more wins. I understand their point. All right, so now we can start. One thing about this like modern era of fighting games is I feel like it's created this like bubble. Advanced fighting game versus simple fighting game. People tend to favor quotations advanced. People want more complex interaction, or they want some form. Yeah, it is like player creativity. But I would say like no matter what, when it comes down to like complex interactions, I'd really say player creativity is essentially just complex interactions. Like you want the ability to be able to interact with things very differently. Simple fighting games, I want to quotation this because like I hate this assessment. Right? I hate this assessment a lot. More direct, linear interactions, typically much more streamlined in character kit. A lot of people do not like this, right? They hate this part. Typically, it forces them to play outside of a way they dislike. Whereas advanced fighting games, typically people want like a lot of room to interact with someone, though typically people don't want it in a way they dislike, which means that they probably don't like anyone above top 7 in the game. Simple fighting games tend to be a little more like, it's usually just like the character is at the top tend to just do something much better, which feels a lot worse than games like quotations advanced fighting games. Now, the reason why I'm breaking these things down for you is because not a lot of people actually think past this point, but there's a pretty significant, I guess, problem with a lot of people who prefer advanced fighting games. A lot of people don't want to learn the simple interactions, but prefer the vast option of an advanced fighting game. Pretty much a lot of people don't want to learn simple interactions, but they prefer like how many options you can theoretically do in an advanced fighting game. Usually this isn't actually a preference for advanced games, it's a preference of doing what you want. Usually in simple fighting game, there's usually a designated answer in interaction. People like advanced fighting games for the same reason that people would do like rock, scissors, paper, gun. Like, I'm not trying to play your fucking guessing game. I'm not throwing rock. I'm throwing fucking gun. You just win. Whereas simple fighting games, usually it's like you answer this with rock or you lose. The reason why this is so important, and I've spent a lot of time building this up already, is because not many people understand that. And in fact, I would say like even before, like in Exert, I would say my weakness was like RPSing. Just because I didn't have a super good way of experimenting with RPS in Exert by nature of how the game developed. We're going to talk about egos again. Is there an emoji? I need this very badly. Here we go. I actually unironically just Googled that. I just wanted to let you guys know. People prefer to bypass the basic as a way of making themselves feel better about their position. I should say their status. When I was first new to fighting games, I refused to ever do a tutorial. Point where I didn't even know how to fucking block, and I wasn't even doing the tutorial. I was more focused on trying to learn the character than like even learn how to block, which is like as like important as the other thing. Like if you don't block, I mean, I would look up a lot of like advanced guides on YouTube and stuff like this. Not because I actually wanted to be, well, I did want to be good at the game, but it wasn't about actually being good at the game or like I was passionate about the game. It was that I wanted the status. I wanted the status of being like not a beginner at this game. Advanced games imply a level of, I guess, complexity or difficulty, which makes the process of learning more forgiving. Think of it like this. Like a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, like of course, like if you're trying to learn how to play Tekken and you have no idea about any of the moves, how to even block, and like people are doing like 1, 2, 3, 4s and counting on you and shit like that, and you're just dying. Like most people will be like, yeah, like, you know, there's a lot of stuff to learn. There's a lot of knowledge checks. People are not they're not as forgiving. Right? They're not as forgiving because simplified games imply a lack of complexity or difficulty. It's a process of learning less forgiving. You can almost tell just by how I write this that this is not correct. Or I guess the way they want to answer like interactions, it may not be as strong in a more simplified game. And as a result, they may just tend to feel worse. In a simplified fighting game, usually there are some options that will just straight up boil down into this. For offense, throw beats blocking, blocking beats, say block swings, just to see. Whereas for a more complex game, remember I used the example of Johnny earlier. Same thing, right? It's same basic RPS, except usually they have ways of, messing with the this system, right? So like, let's say IB makes blocking a more offensive option. If people are IBing or FDing everything you do, the correct thing is not to run strike, right? Or throw. Narrows down RPS into specific interactions that require experience, right? Like no matter what, it's still going to boil down into those interactions. Not a lot of people actually understand that they're pretty much doing the same exact thing. Like you're doing the same shit in plus R and in Exert as you are in Strive for the most part. It's just not as it's just not as visible. Strive cuts the crap out. Exactly. That's why I actually was a big fan of Strive when it released. The problem with things like this, the amount of times people would actually be able to figure this stuff out or adapt to it or know the system that well. Like this situation, I have an answer for it and I have like an anecdote off of it, but it's only happened to me maybe 3 times across my life. I played KV in bracket twice, I think, and then 1 time on casuals. And that's it. Even though when I break down this interaction, not many people are actually interested in this aspect of it. I think a lot of people, they idolize it looking back, but like, I think if they played it, I mean, if people really wanted complexity or like shit like that, they would have just played Exert. Like what? Nobody played it. So I find it hard to believe even to this day. If you struggle with advanced games or like hard games, nobody's gonna say like, oh, stupid baby, or what are you playing, diaper baby, struggling to do a fucking electric 3 times over, you know what I mean? Like it's, nobody ever says shit like that. Tend to learn more advanced topics and strategies early and lack the more basic one. Not because they're not learning, this is an important one here, but because of how advanced offense tends to be. So like, let's say, even though this example will not come up for like a lot of people, like I said, the fact is it still can. And some people, when they're new, only learn things like this. A lot of people don't understand the inherent learning process behind simplified. A lot of people tend to learn how to run a lot of layer 1 offense, but nothing beyond that. I think due to how a lot of people tend to associate simplified games with negativity, it encourages a lack of exploration in this simplified game. Isn't it kind of funny? The problem I had with advanced games, so to speak, was that really no one did the advanced shit, right? It's like people wanted the advanced aspect of it, but nobody did it. Like, the amount of people that did like OSs to cover offense or like anything like that, like people don't do it. Even in Strive, people don't do a lot of the basic shit, right? Like I know people just now learned or started doing things like backdash or what's it called, safe jump OSs. You know, in Xrd, proxy OSs were around for ages, and they were even better. Even though games are simplified, there will come a certain point where everyone has to develop further. So what do I mean by this? A good example again is how like some players incorporated safe jump OSs, right? Some people don't, which means some people have good safe jumps and some people do not. Even though the interactions can be simplified, it means that a lot of the time when they learn, or maybe as they play, they may not incorporate the same level of thought or decision making into a game like Strive compared to a game like Xrd. There's a lot of reasons for this. Like, let's say if you come from a game that's considered quotations hard, even though RPS can be linear, people's adaptations to it are not as linear. Linear RPS can create as complex of RPS as advanced through playing a high level opponent. You're still interacting with another person. No matter how complicated or simple the game is, the aspect of how complicated the game is usually tends to be boiled down into the other player's skill level, not actually just like how like complex the game is. You have to understand that the barriers for what creates the complicated game isn't even the options. The options can help you and help more people essentially, but it doesn't really mean that, you know, quotations linear games or linear RPS games cannot be complicated because of the fact that there's more than just ABC in the game, right? But when there are things that can help, like movement or like backdashes or walking or, you know, air buttons, whatever, these things all contribute for that, right? Because the identity, like I said, implies a ease of access. The game itself is less credible overall. This is what a lot of people tend to think. In turn, they may have a lot of interactions where they do the inverse of advanced. But there's also a list of players who play simplified games that just force the shittiest RPS imaginable over and over again. And you ask them why they do it, and they're like, well, I have to. I call it the I have to. It's like some like medieval like oath shit. I guess like you could almost view it as some people essentially claim the game is playing itself for them. This is not a game thing, though it can be. There are games that do encourage more RPS than not, right? Like if you create a character whose risk reward is so obscene and it's unmatched, it might as well just be like this. This is an excuse to not learn, basically. It's not great. It's obviously not great. You minimize your ability to answer things just because your own mindset has kind of dictated that there's not much further things can go. If a majority of the player base doesn't improve as fast as someone is constantly inventing new strategies, they are playing themselves, basically. In the case of like Leo, a lot of Leo players always say like they have to do aggressive shit or they have to RPS or like force stuff. And I always thought like, why? Why do they have to do that? Why can't they just whiff punish me? So like, I feel like a lot of people tend to get lazy, or like they just like don't think about it as much. Players essentially focus too much on playing their character and playing it to a way that they deem is right, rather than experimenting and being willing to test other things out. By being unwilling to do that, they tend to always be the second to adapt their strategy. The perspective on simplified identity limits its ability to grow. In fighting games, a lot of people who struggle with like figuring out new stuff, or like tend to like go back to their older games. Obviously there are preferences, or like, you know, this doesn't feel as good, but I also think there's a lot of people who aren't willing to move outside of their comfort zone. Just are like, yeah, I'm gonna stick to my game pretty much. If more people had an open mind about how interactions can go, they would be more likely to improve. It's like RPS, then someone checks you at the door, they're like, you got a card? You're like, yep. That's like, okay, you get in. Now you have to guess correctly. Whereas before, it's just like you use RPS. For a lot of people, especially people who became very successful at Strive and have this problem, I feel like they just need to accept that you gotta just play games and let yourself lose and figure things out, you know?